Hello chess students! In this video we're going to be covering what makes pawns weak, and in the next video we'll cover what makes pawns strong. So here we're talking about weak pawns. And what are weak pawns? Well, usually they come in three different varieties: an isolated pawn, a backwards pawn, and doubled pawns. So in this position, we're looking at an isolated pawn. If you look at the white pawn structure, you'll see one pawn that is not protected by any other pawns, and that is the d4 pawn. It doesn't have any neighbors. They're all gone. So it's stranded by itself, and it makes it kind of weak, especially on a semi-open file where the other opponent's pieces can attack it. And it's also weak because it cannot be protected by any other pawns. So this is an isolated pawn. And let's take a look at the next type of weak pawn, which is a backwards pawn. The black d6 pawn right there, that is a backwards pawn. And it's weak because if it ever tries to move forward like this, it can be captured. Let's just say it's white to move. Okay. It can be captured by the pawn attacking it. So this pawn is a backwards pawn, the pawn on d6, and that makes it weak, especially on a semi-open file where white pieces can blockade and attack the weak backward pawn, which can't be protected by any other pawn, so it'll have to be defended by pieces, making those pieces passive and stuck on guard duty. Okay, and then another type of weak pawn are double pawns. If double pawns are connected, they're actually not that weak. But when they are isolated like this, we have an isolated double pawns right here. Black has double pawns on c6 and c5. So double isolated pawns are weak as they can't be protected by any other pawns, and which makes them easy targets to attack, especially in an endgame, where rooks and other pieces can attack the weak double pawns because they cannot be protected by any other pawns. Alright, so we looked at isolated pawns, backwards pawns, and double isolated pawns. And now we're going to take a look at this mix. And I want you to tell me, can you name all of the weak pawns for both sides? All the white weak pawns and all of the black weak pawns. And I want you to think about isolated pawns, backward pawns, and double isolated pawns, or even just doubled pawns. So if you have to pause the video to figure out which are the weak pawns in both white and black's position, go ahead and pause the video and we'll check your solutions. Alrighty, so let's start with the white side first. So these two pawns, white's pawns on c2 and c3, they are doubled and isolated. All right, so they can't be protected by other pawns. That makes them weak. White has an isolated pawn, a single isolated pawn on e4. This pawn can't be protected by other pawns. And white has a backwards pawn on g3, which can't be protected by other pawns. So those are the weak pawns in white's camp. Now let's take a look at black's position. Black has an isolated pawn on h5, which can't be protected by other pawns. White has doubled pawns that are backward pawns. This pawn right here on f6 is backwards because if it tries to move, it'll be captured by the e4 pawn. So we have a doubled backward pawn, and those are the weak pawns in both white and black's camp. All right, let's take a look at how to play against weak pawns. In this position, we're going to take a look at how to play against a weak isolated pawn. Can you tell me which pawn of white's is weak? Yeah, right here on d4. It's an isolated pawn. And when you're playing against an isolated pawn on a semi-open file, what you want to do is you want to attack it, build up pressure on it. And here, it's black to move. So black plays the f-rook to d8, putting pressure on the pawn. And white is going to defend it. And what black does here is it blockades the pawn, preventing white from being able to trade it off. because if you have weak pawns, isolated, backward, or doubled, it's usually a good idea to try to trade them off so you no longer have weak pawns, and your pieces don't have to defend weak pawns. But here, black blockaded the pawn, so this weak isolated pawn cannot move, and black doubles the rooks, putting more pressure on the weak isolated d4 pawn. And now white played rook to c4. Both of its rooks are passive because they are stuck on guard duty, defending its weak pawn. And now black has this tactic where he can win a pawn because this white pawn is in a relative pin. Because if it captures this pawn, what is black's best move here? Well, it can capture a rook, and even better, that's checkmate. Okay, so that was one way to play against a weak isolated pawn. We blockaded the isolated pawn, and then we doubled up rooks on the isolated pawn, and then finally we have this tactic. We can play pawn to e5, and black is just going to win a pawn here with a winning endgame position because black has an extra pawn and it's a passed pawn. It's a strong pawn. All right, let's go ahead and move on to another position here where it is white to move. Now, white has this isolated weak d pawn, but it's white to move. And remember, if you have an opportunity to trade off a weak pawn, it's usually a good idea to do so. So here, white can get rid of his weak isolated pawn by just playing pawn to d5. And then pawn captures, and now white's position is stronger as its rooks can be active without having to defend a weak isolated pawn. So if you have a weak pawn and you can trade it off, it's a good idea to trade off your weak pawns. All right, here we have white has a weak pawn. Can you find white's weak pawn? Yeah, it's right here. It's a backward pawn on a semi-open file. So black pieces can easily attack this weak backward pawn. And this is how to play, if you're black, how to play against this pawn and try to win it. So black is first going to attack this backwards pawn, forcing white to have to use one of its rooks to defend this weak pawn, making this rook passive. Remember, rooks love to be on open files, to attack, to be active. But right now, this rook can't, because if it tries to be active, it's going to lose this backwards pawn. So this white rook is defending the backwards pawn. And what does the black rook does? It blockades. It prevents white from being able to push this pawn to get rid of this weak pawn. So this pawn now is stuck here because of the black rook on c4 blockading the weak c3 pawn. And white's going to try to double the rooks here to get two defenders on this pawn because white knows this rook is coming here to build up even more pressure on this weak backwards pawn. And sure enough, here we go. All right, now, are white's rooks active? Not at all. They're very passive. They are stuck defending a weak backwards pawn. And now black is going to try this similar tactic in the last position where it's going to put this, try to go for pawn to b4 and put this pawn in a pin, because then the two pieces will be able to win a rook here. And so white is trying to stop pawn to b4, but black now can target another weak pawn because black has active rooks, white has passive rooks guarding a weak pawn. And now black is attacking this a3 pawn. The white rook moves over to defend it. So now both white rooks are defending two separate pawns. And now we have this tactic that wins material because if you see, both of these pawns are pinned. If this pawn captures, like here, it's going to lose a rook. And if this pawn captures, it's going to lose a rook. So therefore, black is going to win material by capturing this pawn. So here, white cannot take, and let's just say white plays a move like this, then you have, there you go. And that black is now up a pawn and a nice strong passed pawn as well, and still has pressure on this weak pawn and pressure on this weak pawn. So white or black definitely has a winning advantage in this endgame. All right, next chapter. Okay, now here it is white to move. Where is white's weak pawn? Right here on d4. It is a weak backwards pawn, but it's white to move. Can white trade off its weak pawn? Can you see how? Yeah, it can just push the pawn to d5 and get rid of that weak pawn. And black is going after this pawn. It's protected, but white's going to add additional protection by playing pawn to e4. And by trading off the weak backwards pawn, white has improved its position, and now its rooks can be active without having to defend a weak pawn. All right, that's the lesson on weak pawns. In the next video, we will talk about what makes pawns strong. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.